going through the information that's in that sort of course notes document, but in a little bit more of an abbreviated fashion, and just covering this on the blackboard here. But
Geometri
say, all of
bir
this,
jadwal geometri.
it's up to you whether or not you kind of try and copy this down as I'm doing it. You will find all of this information in those notes anyway. So, chapter 1 is going to be ODE models in biology. And this chapter is probably where there's going to be the most overlap with mathematical biology A last semester. And effectively that's because we're going to need to introduce some of the basic modelling techniques, some of the basic sort of methods of analysing them, such as non-dimensionalisation, phase plane analysis, stability analysis, etc., to allow anybody that didn't do that course the opportunity to kind of see those sort of techniques. So anyway, we're going to be kind of doing that. We are going to be doing this, of course, though, within the context of different applications. And in particular, I'm going to start in a very, very simple way and consider problems to do with bacteria and cell growth. So we're going to look at bacteria and cell growth to start off with. And, well, I probably don't have to tell you that cell growth is absolutely fundamental, and understanding it is massively important in a lot of different sort of contexts. And that can kind of range from bacteria cells. So bacteria, of course, we have lots of bacteria in our body. Some of them are harmful, some of them are good, etc. And bacteria, if you give them the right sort of environment, the right sort of nutrients, they will grow. And they will grow very quickly. Certain bacteria, roughly every 10 or 15 minutes or so, are able to divide, and that can give rise to a rapid growth of the population. This is speeded up, obviously. These are clearly this sort of video here, but what you're seeing there is a population of bacteria steadily growing from a single cell. So, bacteria is a very important example of cell growth. We often want to understand the growth dynamics of bacteria populations. That's important for understanding what happens when you get an infection in your body, etc., etc. But of course, growth is also happening in all of our cells in our body all the time. We're constantly shedding cells from the surface of our skin. We need to replace those, so our skin has to constantly generate new cells. We're constantly losing blood cells that have become depleted after a number of days. Our body needs to replace those. If you cut yourself, obviously, your body needs to repair that tissue, and the cells need to proliferate in order to do that. And then, of course, in a slightly more sinister sort of example of growth, cell growth, cancers grow because cells lose their normal behavior and typically then start to divide and grow and form a cancerous cancer within our skin. And this sort of short video here is showing pancreatic cancerous cells dividing, and they look slightly different. They're much more active. They can grow and divide, and that obviously has potentially very harmful aspects. So we obviously kind of want to study how it's obviously, given this kind of real massive importance of cell growth, it's essential that we have good models to describe how cells are growing. So let's kind of now think about how we could model that. And let's kind of do a couple of interactive sort of quizzes. So if you have your kind of mobile phone switched on, and if you go to this sort of website here, www.menti.com, then use this code here, you should be able to kind of get up to this sort of page here, and just to kind of get you sort of thinking about this problem of cell growth. I'm not giving you much information here, it's just a kind of a snap quiz here. Suppose a bacterium divides regularly every 10 minutes. If we start from a single bacterium, how long would it take for the, sorry, that should say population, to weigh more than the Earth? And yeah, there's nothing, there's no real calculation to do here. Just sort of put in what you would kind of expect based on that sort of information.
شغل نزل طاف نزل التطبيق يا مينيتون ترى مصوته كله نزل مينيتون من تايم تاون اسمه من تايم تاون
Okay.
خلاص طلع وداع
People are still kind of putting it in there, but yeah, we're getting a kind of, it's actually looking quite, you know, sort of nice, sort of curve here that's sort of, yeah, probably peaking around the sort of like days, weeks, sort of months. But even still, a few out there kind of saying years and decades there. So, you know, that, I mean, that sounds all kind of quite sort of reasonable there. Those responses. I haven't really given you any information there, so, you know, as I say, it's not really much of a test. Let's give you more precise information. So let's assume these bacteria still divide every 10 minutes or so. Well, given that a kind of an E. coli bacterium weighs about 10 to the power minus 15 kilograms, really tiny. The Earth weighs about 10 to the 24 to 10 to the 25 kilograms. So there's effectively almost a 40 order magnitude of difference between those two. Given that, well, how long would it take? And if you really want, try and write down a quick model to do that, to estimate that.
خلاص اكتب
Okay, so again, sort of, you know, I mean, those are kind of mirroring the earlier sort of good responses there as well, actually. So, and again, we're kind of seeing quite a lot of, probably kind of peaking around the kind of the 22 days to 22 weeks sort of mark there. Okay, so let's actually now kind of think about this, you know, more formally, and come up with some models, some very basic models for cell growth. So, starting point is, as I said, cell growth is crucial. I've given various examples in the course notes there, but I've already really just kind of tried to portray that cell growth is a massively important thing. Now let's now actually try and come up with some suitable models for doing that. And there's a lot of different sort of philosophies for modelling. And the philosophy of this course is we're going to start with the simplest model. So, if you're trying to model complex phenomena, well, one approach is to try and incorporate as much detail as you can into it. Get a model that brings in everything that you know about the system. And, well, that's certainly a valid approach, but then you end up with a very complex sort of model. So the other extreme is to try and come up with the simplest possible model, and if that kind of then fits the data, well, that's fine. But if it fails, you then progressively add more detail. So, and that's going to be the kind of the philosophy that we take in this course. We start with the simplest model and add more detail if it fails. And the reason for this is, of course, if you've got a simple model, you can probably analyse it. It becomes very hard to analyse complex models, and even actually very kind of quite innocuous looking equations can turn out to be really challenging to study mathematically. So that's going to be our problem here, and our first model is for constant growth rate. So, suppose we have a bacteria population that divides at regular intervals. E.g. every 10 minutes. Okay, so that's an example of a constant growth rate. The bacterium is dividing every 10 minutes progressively. So we have a constant growth rate there. Well, if we let B a T, denote my bacteria number at time t. And the classic model to describe this case is a very, very simple one. You'll have seen it in lots of previous courses. It will be simply dB by dt is some parameter r, my growth rate, times B and T. Okay. The growth of the population at any instance is going to be proportional to the number of bacteria because they're all potentially dividing. And this R, the growth rate, is simply a constant. And we can assume, obviously only really makes sense if that's positive, you know, our cells will grow. And actually, if we're talking about we've kind of got things defined in terms of some doubling time, which say my cells are dividing every 10 minutes, we can actually say that my R is equal to log 2 over the doubling time. So that kind of growth rate would kind of be written in terms of this doubling time. So for that early problem, R would be log 2 over 10. So that's a very straightforward differential equation. It's one that can be solved explicitly. I don't need to tell you the solution to that is simply the exponential growth law. So B of t is going to be e to the RT, where B naught is equal to the initial bacteria density. Well, if that's the sort of model that you had in mind for kind of solving this sort of problem, then once we've kind of written it down in this form, we've actually got all of the information that we would need to answer that sort of problem here. So for the problem, what do we have as information? Well, we would want to find B naught, so E is the initial weight of the population. So B naught is going to be 10 to the minus 15 kilograms. R is my R R is related to my doubling time, so R would be log 2 over 10. I said they double every 10 minutes. We want to find T such that B of T is equal to the weight of the Earth, so 6 times 10 to the 24, and will be equal to 10 to the minus 16 times E to the log 2 over 10 T. And if you do that calculation, it tells the T would be about 22 ounces. So, just plugging in that information. Well, of course, that kind of example, we did have a few people kind of saying that, but people were clearly kind of more going to the sort of weeks and months sort of cases. But what this shows is really the power of exponential growth. That, you know, even for this kind of very kind of extreme sort of case where we start with a bacteria of very, very small weight, if you assume exponential growth with it's actually relatively reasonable as a growth rate. Bacteria can divide roughly up to 10 every 10 minutes, and if that was the case, then that bacteria population would reach the mass of the Earth in less than a day. Okay. So, exponential growth is a model, but can be a reasonable model for growth of a population in certain instances, but we can clearly see that it's ultimately unrealistic. It gives unbounded growth. We naturally wouldn't expect that bacteria population to grow infinitely, you know, in such a sort of time. There's got to be things that stop that. So, unbounded growth. And that's, of course, ultimately unrealistic. But nevertheless, exponential growth models are still used to describe population, and they can actually sometimes provide quite a reasonable description of a growth of a population in early sort of time. In fact, you know, it was first sort of used as a way to describe human population growth, and for quite long periods, human growth has indeed been following a kind of an exponential sort of curve. So, it's an ultimately unrealistic model, but that doesn't necessarily mean it should just be dismissed out of hand. But it is ultimately unrealistic, and and clearly, it's not feasible that we can have this sort of situation here where a bacteria carries on growing. So, what could be the sort of things that could stop that unbounded growth? Well, bacteria could die. They clearly that's quite sort of likely. They can die as well as divide, so you could potentially incorporate that. But perhaps more important than anything is bacteria, of course, they can't just sort of grow without anything. They need nutrients to grow. They take in sugars, etc., etc. They use that kind of the energy from that to grow and divide. And of course, as the population gets larger, you take away more and more nutrients from your environment, and eventually that's going to lead to a cessation of growth. So let's now kind of consider a slightly more sophisticated model, where our growth rate depends on a nutrient. So, how are we going to kind of extend our model? So, assume now that the growth rate of bacteria depends on the amount of nutrients. And we're going to assume further that after t equals 0, no further nutrient is provided. Okay, so we've got a closed system, we've got a population of bacteria, and initially we're going to give them some nutrient, but we then seal them inside something so that we don't give them more nutrient as time goes on. So those are going to be the kind of the two assumptions. How do we write down a model for this? Well, first, one simple extension from the previous one is that we can't just think about only the population of the bacteria, we also need to consider a variable for the amount of nutrients. So now B of T is my bacteria, number or density, and my N of T is going to be my nutrient level. My bacteria divide, they divide with a growth rate that depends on the amount of nutrient. So if I kind of take that simple exponential growth model above, then or maybe what I can consider now is that dB by dt, but that growth rate's now just going to depend on my nutrient level. So it could be, I could suppose it's some function k of n times my dB by dt will be k of n times v. And what about my nutrient? As I say, the nutrient are consuming the bacteria are consuming the nutrient in order to divide. So what kind of would make sense is that for my nutrient, it's just going to be some minus some constant alpha times the rate of bacteria growth. The rate at which the nutrient will be depleted will be proportional to the rate at which the bacteria are growing. And that's so alpha times k of n times t. Okay, so I've now got a two variable model. I need some initial conditions for this. Start with some population of bacteria, call it B naught, and some amount of nutrient, N naught, to N naught. So if I want to complete it, I can just sort of write down those sort of equations. Okay. Okay. So what are going to be the dynamics of this? Well, we haven't really kind of specified yet, though, what this kind of form for this function k of n is. So this growth rate's now depending on the nutrient. But there's obviously kind of a lot of choices we could potentially choose. But again, as I say, we're going to use the simplest possible modelling assumptions that we can do, because that way we can probably get an analytically tractable model. We're going to specifically assume that k of n is simply given by, it's going to be linearly proportional to n. Okay? We expect with more nutrient, the bacteria can divide quickly. If nutrient is low, the bacteria will divide slowly. So we would want some increasing function of n, and probably the simplest model is just going to be some linear growth law. K of n is equal to Rn, so it's something that looks like this. Okay, so that's it. That's probably the simplest sort of case. And we call such a sort of assumption that it's linear dependence. So hence, what does our model look like? Well, dB by dt will be equal to R times n times b, and the n by dt is going to be minus alpha rnb, or we can just write that as minus alpha dB by dt. But normally when you kind of write down second order systems of ODEs, you know, it's quite rare that you're able to kind of solve them to get a kind of an explicit solution. You then usually have to kind of rely on things like steady state analysis, phase plane analysis, things that we're going to be looking at as this sort of chapter kind of goes on here. In this sort of case though, the model is sufficiently simple that we can actually solve this. We can eliminate one of these sort of variables to get an analytical solution. And the way you can kind of do that is, if we look at this sort of second equation here, dn by dt is equal to minus alpha dB by dt. So calling this one equation star, we integrate star, we get, that tells us very simply that b n of t is going to be equal to some constant c, constant of integration, minus alpha b of t. And of course, we've kind of got specific initial conditions up above, so you could kind of actually, from the initial conditions, we could work out that c would be given by n naught plus alpha b naught. Okay, so just by straightforward integration, we get an expression for n in terms of b. We can then substitute that into the equation for b. Substitute into equation for b of t implies we're going to get a model form b by bt is going to be r times b times c minus alpha b. And, well, it's a lot of parameters there. Let's just kind of write that a little bit more in just in terms of a couple of parameters. Let's kind of write that as r times b times bk minus b, where r is equal to r alpha and bk is equal to c over alpha. And this may be an equation that some of you are familiar with. This is the logistic, describes a logistic growth rate, or logistic growth law with growth rate big R and carrying capacity. So big R times K and carrying capacity. Okay. And that equation, if you did mathematical biology A last semester, you would already be familiar with that. Okay, so for this sort of just simple extension to incorporate this sort of depletion of some nutrient, and this depletion of the nutrient limiting the bacterial growth rate, we get to a second sort of model for population growth, which turns out to be a logistic growth. Well, it turns out you can solve this equation analytically. So this is actually of the form of, this is effectively the form of a separable first order ODE. So you can solve it using standard solution methods for ODEs. So solving, and I'm going to leave this as an exercise. We're not going to be doing any really complicated solving of ODE equations in this course, but we are going to be doing quite a lot of solving of sort of strict, simple first order ODEs using techniques such as recognizing them as being a form of separable ODEs, potentially linear ODEs, etc., etc. So it's kind of well worthwhile trying to remind yourself some of those sort of basic sort of solution techniques. So I'm going to leave that as an exercise, and then if anybody has questions about that, don't hesitate to ask during the tutorial classes, because as I say, it's a very key skill that you're going to need to tackle some of the problems. Anyway, solving this is going to give basically B of t be equal to k b naught over k minus b naught e to the minus k r d plus b. Okay. And as I say, I really would recommend that you try and sort of do that, try and solve that yourself to see if you can get to this sort of answer. Okay, so in this case we've got an explicit analytical solution for K of t. For B of t. What does that look like? Well, that's where you can kind of use a little bit of kind of elementary sort of curve sketching. So we want to plot B of t as a function of time. Well, what kind of happens in this sort of equation? Well, we know we start with, when t is equal to 0, we start down here, some value b naught. We can also kind of assume that you can kind of we kind of want to see what happens as t gets sort of large here. Well, as t becomes large, this term will be disappeared, and we'll be left as t approaches infinity. B of t is equal to k b naught over b naught. So if k, this carrying capacity big K, is bigger than b naught, what we're going to do is get a growth curve where we kind of increase initially in a kind of more or less exponential sort of way, but then as t approaches infinity, the population becomes limited at the carrying capacity. And as I say, it's a slight simple extension, therefore allows us to get models where rather than getting a kind of an unbounded growth of the population, over time it sort of saturates. So, okay. Well, we can also choose more complicated forms for K of n. So earlier I kind of assumed that kind of growth rate was depending linearly on the amount of nutrients in the environment. So effectively, as I say earlier on, we kind of assumed my K of n, do this already, but was looking something like this. Well, that's probably not realistic when you kind of think about this, because if we assume that sort of law, well, it would say if we give a huge amount of nutrient to our cell population, they can divide at a very fast rate, as fast as we wanted, effectively. As n tends to infinity, k tends to infinity. But there's a bound on how quick cells can divide. Those bacteria can divide very, very quickly, roughly every 10 minutes. The cells of our body, though, tend to divide a little bit more slowly, and then maximum maybe every 10 hours, 20 hours, or something like that. But typically, much slower than that. And there's a natural limitation because there's a machinery involved in order for a cell to divide. It has to create two versions of itself. It has to replicate DNA. It has to split itself. Those are mechanical things. They have natural time constraints. So this kind of K of n to be linear is probably also not realistic, and perhaps a more realistic case would be to have some sort of form which, rather than going out to infinity, becomes saturated after some sort of time. So, okay. And a suitable way of kind of choosing that choose what we call a saturating sort of form, and a very straightforward and oft-used model for that would be to take k of n to be r times n over some constant, call it gamma, plus n. So, more realistic form is k of n saturated at high n, e.g. k of n is equal to r n over. But, as I say, when we try and do modelling, we try often to get the simplest possible model, because with the simplest model, you've got the best chance of being able to get an analytical solution. Okay. And indeed, in this last example, we were actually able to go through the steps and write down an analytical solution for our model. But that's quite rarely the case, certainly as we build more complicated models. And in the next couple of lectures, we're going to be looking at an extension of these ideas to consider the growth of a bacteria population in what's called a chemostat. And there we're going to build an ODE model. It's not going to look much more complicated than this, but it's one that turns out to be analytically intractable. And we're going to need, therefore, to look at things like phase plane analyses, stability analyses in order to understand the behaviour. We'll finish there for today, and as I say, pick this up tomorrow, and those next two lectures are going to be taught by Dr. Maria.
صورتها بس؟ ارسلها لي بس ما اسكت. قال سجل غلط.